August 15, 1945, Victory over Japan Day. Across America, celebrations erupted in every city and town. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square, factory workers embraced in the streets, and church bells rang from coast to coast. But in a remote corner of Montana, 300 miles from the nearest major city, a different kind of history was quietly unfolding. A convoy of military trucks rolled through endless prairie grass toward a hastily constructed prisoner of war camp outside the small ranching town of Red Lodge. Inside those trucks sat 42 Japanese women, ranging in age from 19 to 37, their faces masks of exhaustion and uncertainty. They were among the rarest prisoners of war America had ever held, female auxiliaries captured in the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific Campaign. Before we discover how these remarkable women would transform an entire community's understanding of their enemy, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The camp itself was unlike the large facilities that housed thousands of German and Italian prisoners across the United States. This was a converted ranch property, surrounded by towering mountains and endless sky, with wooden barracks that still smelled of fresh pine. The location had been chosen precisely because of its isolation. Military officials in Washington had debated for weeks about where to house Japanese women prisoners, knowing that public sentiment against Japan ran far deeper and more bitter than feelings toward European enemies. Montana seemed safe, far from coastal cities where anti-Japanese sentiment burned hottest, far from the internment camps that held Japanese Americans, and far from anywhere that might cause political complications. As the trucks came to a stop, the women could see their guards for the first time in daylight. These weren't the stern-faced military police they had encountered at processing centers in California. These were local men, ranchers and cowboys who had been deputized to help guard the facility. They wore a strange mixture of military uniforms and civilian clothing, wide-brimmed hats that cast shadows across weathered faces, boots caked with dust, and expressions that betrayed their own uncertainty about this unusual assignment. Most had never seen a Japanese person before, let alone been responsible for guarding Japanese women. Among the prisoners was 24-year-old Keiko Tanaka, a former military nurse from Osaka who had been captured on Okinawa while evacuating wounded soldiers. She clutched a small cloth bundle containing the only possessions she had been allowed to keep: a wooden comb her mother had given her, a faded photograph of her family, and a small notebook where she had been secretly recording her experiences. As she stepped down from the truck, her legs unsteady after days of travel, she looked out at the vast Montana landscape. It was beautiful in a way that made her heart ache. The mountains reminded her of home, yet everything else felt impossibly foreign. She had expected to die in battle or be executed as a prisoner. She never imagined she would end up here, in this strange land of endless horizons. The first week at the Montana camp passed in tense silence, broken only by barked commands and the shuffling of feet. The Japanese women moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, their military training evident in every gesture. They lined up for roll call with backs straight and eyes forward, ate their meals in complete silence, and returned to their barracks without a word to their captors. The American guards watched them with equal parts curiosity and discomfort, uncertain how to interact with prisoners who were so fundamentally different from the boisterous German and Italian men they had heard about in other camps. Captain Robert Morrison, the camp commander, had spent 20 years in the Army, but nothing had prepared him for this assignment. He was a career officer accustomed to clear protocols and established procedures. Female prisoners of war, especially Japanese ones, fell outside every manual he had ever studied. He had requested female personnel to help oversee the camp, but the request had been denied due to shortages. Instead, he had a group of local ranchers who knew more about cattle than military procedure, and a handful of older military police who had been deemed too old for Pacific combat but suitable for guard duty. The language barrier made everything more complicated. None of the guards spoke Japanese, and initial assessments suggested that only a handful of the women had any English knowledge at all. Communication happened through gestures, demonstrations, and occasionally through crude drawings. The women were shown where to sleep, where to eat, where to work, and where the boundaries of the camp extended. They nodded understanding and complied without protest, their faces revealing nothing of what they might be thinking or feeling. The cowboys found the whole situation deeply uncomfortable. These men had grown up with a code that treated women with a certain deference, regardless of circumstance. Jake Patterson, a 26-year-old ranch hand from a spread 30 miles north, had volunteered for guard duty because his bad knee had kept him out of military service and he wanted to contribute somehow to the war effort. He had imagined guarding dangerous enemy soldiers, perhaps preventing escape attempts or maintaining order among hostile prisoners. Instead, he found himself responsible for women who looked exhausted and frightened, who reminded him unsettlingly of his own sister and her friends. The prisoners' barracks were sparse but clean, each woman assigned a narrow cot with rough wool blankets and a small wooden box for personal belongings. Keiko had claimed a bed near the window, drawn to any view of the outside world. At night, she could hear some of the younger women crying softly into their pillows, homesick and terrified, despite their stoic daytime demeanor. She wanted to comfort them, but felt paralyzed by her own uncertainty. What could she say? That everything would be fine? She had no idea if that was true. They were enemies of America, captured soldiers who had served an empire that had attacked Pearl Harbor and brought unspeakable destruction across Asia. What mercy could they possibly expect? Keiko Tanaka had been trained to serve the emperor without question, to sacrifice everything for Japan's divine mission, and to face death with dignity if capture became inevitable. But nothing in her training had prepared her for the profound disorientation of being a prisoner in America. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, so vast and empty compared to the crowded cities and carefully cultivated fields of Japan. At night, the stars seemed impossibly bright and numerous, scattered across a black sky in patterns she didn't recognize. Even the constellations were different here, reminding her just how far from home she truly was. During the day, she observed everything with the careful attention to detail that had made her an excellent nurse. She noticed how the American guards moved, how they spoke to each other with casual familiarity that seemed to disregard rank and hierarchy. She watched how they worked, repairing fences and maintaining the camp with a practical efficiency that lacked the rigid formality she was accustomed to. Most puzzling of all was their treatment of the prisoners. There was no cruelty, no deliberate humiliation, none of the brutality she had been told to expect from the barbaric Americans. Instead, there was an awkward courtesy that seemed almost apologetic. She had begun keeping a diary again, writing in tiny characters on the precious pages of her notebook. It was forbidden, she knew, but the need to process her experiences through writing had become overwhelming. In Japanese, she recorded her observations, her fears, and her questions. She wrote about the strange food they were served, white bread and canned vegetables, and meat that came in mysterious, processed forms. She wrote about the coffee, bitter and strong, that the Americans seemed to drink constantly. She wrote about the other women, noting who seemed to be coping well and who appeared to be struggling with despair. Among the prisoners, Keiko had naturally emerged as a leader despite having no official rank. Her nursing experience gave her authority, and her calm demeanor provided stability for the younger women. 18-year-old Yuki Matsumoto, who had served as a radio operator before her capture, had latched onto Keiko like a younger sister seeking guidance. Yuki cried every night, whispering about her parents in Hiroshima, wondering if they had survived the mysterious new weapon that had destroyed the city. Keiko had no answers to give her, no comfort that didn't feel like a lie. The routines established in that first week became their anchor to sanity. Morning roll call at 6 o'clock, breakfast at 7, work assignments at 8. The women were given tasks around the camp: cleaning, laundry, kitchen assistance, basic maintenance work. They performed these duties with the same meticulous care they had brought to their military service, finding purpose in even the most mundane tasks. It was easier to focus on scrubbing floors or folding laundry than to think about what had been lost, what might never be recovered, or what uncertain future awaited them. The late August heat in Montana was different from anything Keiko had experienced in Japan. The air was dry and relentless, sucking moisture from skin and throat, making every breath feel like inhaling dust. By afternoon, the sun beat down on the camp with an intensity that made the barracks feel like ovens. The women worked through it with grim determination, refusing to show weakness before their captors, but the heat was taking its toll. Several of the younger prisoners had begun showing signs of heat exhaustion, their faces pale and their hands trembling as they tried to continue their assigned tasks. Jake Patterson had been watching the women struggle for 3 days, his discomfort growing with each passing hour. He had grown up working cattle in this climate and knew the signs of heat sickness when he saw them. These women were drinking water, but not nearly enough, and they seemed to view any break from work as a failure of discipline. On the third afternoon of the heat wave, he made a decision that would change everything. He walked to the camp's small supply shed, pulled out a wooden crate, and began loading it with bottles from the icebox that the guards used to keep their drinks cold. The other guards watched him with curiosity as he carried the heavy crate across the compound toward where the women were working in the laundry area. Sergeant Williams, an older military policeman from Texas, called out to him, "Patterson, what are you doing with those Coca-Colas? Those are for us, not the prisoners." Jake stopped and turned back, his jaw set with determination. "Sarge, it's 105 degrees out here. These women are going to pass out if we don't do something. It's just good sense." Sergeant Williams considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Your supplies to waste, I suppose, but don't come crying to me when you're drinking warm water for the rest of the week." Keiko saw the tall cowboy approaching with the crate and immediately tensed, wondering what new development this might bring. The women had learned to be wary of any deviation from routine, any unexpected interaction with their guards. Jake set the crate down on a wooden table near where they were working and began pulling out the bottles. The glass was covered in condensation, tiny droplets running down the dark brown surface. He used a bottle opener attached to his belt to pop the caps off, the distinctive fizzing sound drawing the attention of all the women. Then, in gestures and simple words, he indicated that they should take the bottles and drink. The women looked at each other uncertainly. Yuki whispered to Keiko in Japanese, "What is it? Is it safe?" Keiko studied the bottles carefully. She had heard of Coca-Cola before the war, had seen it mentioned in confiscated American magazines that the military used for intelligence purposes. It was supposed to be a popular American beverage, though she had never tasted it. Jake, sensing their hesitation, picked up one of the bottles himself and took a long drink, then smiled and gestured again for them to take the others. Slowly, cautiously, Keiko reached out and accepted a bottle. The glass was shockingly cold against her palm, almost painful after hours in the heat. She raised it to her lips and took a small, tentative sip. The sensation was unlike anything Keiko had ever experienced. The liquid was ice cold, sweet beyond belief, and filled with tiny bubbles that fizzed and popped against her tongue and throat. The carbonation startled her, making her cough slightly, but underneath the initial shock was a flavor that was strangely compelling. It was sweet but not cloying, with mysterious undertones she couldn't quite identify. She took another sip, slower this time, letting the cold liquid ease the dryness in her throat. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions, their eyes widening with surprise as they tasted Coca-Cola for the first time. Yuki giggled despite herself, the bubbles tickling her nose. It was the first sound of genuine amusement any of them had made since arriving at the camp. The other women looked at her in surprise, then several of them smiled too, small tentative expressions that transformed their tired faces. They held the bottles carefully, as if the cold glass containers were precious objects, which, in that moment, they were. Jake watched their reactions with evident satisfaction, pleased that his gesture had been received well. He said something in English that none of them understood, but his tone was friendly, almost apologetic, that he hadn't thought to do this sooner. Keiko found herself studying this cowboy more carefully. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wore his uniform shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms tanned dark from outdoor work. His wide-brimmed hat cast shadows across his face, but she could see genuine concern in his expression, not the cold efficiency of a soldier simply following orders. He seemed uncomfortable with his role as guard, as if he wasn't quite sure how to reconcile watching over prisoners with his obvious inclination toward basic human kindness. As the women drank their Coca-Colas, the atmosphere in the camp shifted almost imperceptibly. The rigid tension that had characterized every interaction for the past week began to soften slightly. The beverage itself became a kind of bridge between two groups who shared no common language but could share this simple moment of relief from the oppressive heat. Some of the women nodded their thanks to Jake, bowing slightly in the Japanese manner. He touched the brim of his hat in response, a cowboy's gesture of respect that they didn't understand but recognized as courteous. That evening in the barracks, the women talked about the incident in hushed Japanese conversations. Some were suspicious, wondering if the kindness was a manipulation tactic, a way to make them lower their guard before some trap was sprung. Others, including Keiko, weren't so sure. She had seen genuine concern in the cowboy's face, the same expression she had seen in doctors and fellow nurses when they worried about patients suffering unnecessarily. She wrote in her diary that night, describing the taste of Coca-Cola in careful detail, trying to capture not just the flavor, but the strange feeling of receiving unexpected kindness from someone who should have been her enemy. The cold sweetness of that drink represented something she didn't yet have words for, a possibility she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Perhaps Americans were not the monsters she had been taught to fear. The Coca-Cola incident became a turning point, though the change happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Jake continued bringing cold drinks to the women during the worst heat of the afternoon, and other guards began following his example. Sergeant Williams, initially skeptical, started showing the women how to take more frequent water breaks, demonstrating with exaggerated gestures and simple words. The women, in turn, began to relax slightly in the presence of their captors, no longer flinching when a guard approached or maintaining quite such rigid postures during their work. Keiko discovered that she remembered more English than she had realized. Before the war, she had studied basic English in school, though speaking it had been discouraged as Japan's relationship with America deteriorated. Now, those half-forgotten lessons began surfacing in her memory. She started with simple words, listening carefully when the guards spoke to each other and picking out terms she recognized. Water, food, thank you, good morning. She practiced silently in her mind, afraid to speak aloud until she was more confident. The other women noticed her attention to the guards' conversations and began asking her in Japanese what certain words meant. Jake noticed Keiko's interest in learning English before she worked up the courage to speak. He saw how she watched his mouth when he talked, how her lips sometimes moved silently as if repeating words to herself. One afternoon, as he brought the daily supply of cold drinks, he pointed to the Coca-Cola bottle and said clearly, "Coca-Cola." Then he pointed to himself and said, "Jake." He gestured to her, inviting her to share her name. Keiko hesitated, aware that all the other women had stopped their work to watch this interaction. Finally, she pointed to herself and said softly, "Keiko." Jake smiled broadly, pleased by this breakthrough. "Keiko," he repeated, pronouncing it carefully if not perfectly. Then he pointed to the bottle again. "Coca-Cola." She understood what he was doing. He was offering to teach her English words. She pointed to the sky and looked at him questioningly. "Sky," he said. She repeated it. "Sky," her accent thick but the word recognizable. He pointed to the ground. "Ground." She repeated that too. Other guards had gathered to watch this exchange, and soon several of them were pointing to objects and offering English words, while Keiko and a few of the braver women attempted to pronounce them. The language lessons became a daily occurrence, though they remained informal and unstructured. During work breaks, guards would point to tools, buildings, animals, and teach the corresponding English words. Some of the guards discovered they enjoyed teaching, found satisfaction in watching the women's faces light up with understanding when they successfully communicated a new concept. The women, for their part, began teaching Japanese words in return. Jake learned that arigato meant thank you, and he started using it when the women completed their work assignments. The simple exchange of language became an exchange of something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the prisoner-guard relationship. Keiko found that learning English gave her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Each new word felt like a small victory, a way of asserting some control over her circumstances. She began keeping lists of English vocabulary in her diary alongside her Japanese observations, creating a bilingual record of her transformation from enemy soldier to something she couldn't yet define. As September arrived and the oppressive heat began to fade into cooler autumn temperatures, the women's daily routines expanded beyond the confines of the camp compound. Captain Morrison had received authorization to use prisoner labor on nearby ranches that were severely short-handed due to the war. Most young men had gone to fight, leaving aging ranchers and their families struggling to manage large spreads alone. The arrangement benefited everyone. The ranches got desperately needed workers. The military reduced costs of maintaining idle prisoners, and the women gained opportunities to leave the barren campgrounds. Keiko was among the first group selected to work at the Patterson family ranch, the same property where Jake had grown up and still lived with his widowed mother. The drive there took 20 minutes along dusty roads that wound through rolling grasslands dotted with cattle. Keiko sat in the back of the truck with 5 other women, watching the landscape pass by with fascination. Everything was so open, so vast, so different from the carefully ordered rice paddies and crowded villages of rural Japan. The cattle moved in large herds across unfenced rangeland, attended by riders on horseback who appeared as small figures against the enormous sky. Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She was a weathered woman in her early 50s, her face lined from decades of sun and wind, her hands rough from ranch work. She had lost her husband to a heart attack 3 years earlier, and her youngest son was fighting somewhere in the Pacific. The irony of having Japanese prisoners working her land was not lost on her, but she needed the help desperately, and had learned long ago that survival sometimes required setting aside personal feelings. She showed them what needed to be done: mending fences, mucking out stables, hauling feed to distant pastures, and the women set to work with their characteristic diligence. What fascinated Keiko most was watching Jake and the other cowboys work with horses. She had seen horses before, but never handled with such casual expertise. Jake could calm a skittish mare with soft words and gentle touches, could read an animal's mood from the position of its ears and the tension in its muscles. He moved with an economy of motion that came from years of practice, mounting and dismounting with fluid grace, guiding his horse with barely perceptible signals. The other women noticed too, gathering during breaks to watch the cowboys rope cattle or break young horses to saddle. Yuki whispered to Keiko in Japanese, "They're like samurai with their horses." The same partnership, the same respect between rider and animal. Keiko nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Despite all the cultural differences, there were unexpected similarities. The cowboys' code of honor, their connection to the land, their self-reliance, all echoed values that Japanese culture prized. Watching them work, Keiko began to see Americans not as incomprehensible foreigners, but as people shaped by their environment, just as she had been shaped by hers. October brought the first real cold to Montana, frost covering the grass in the mornings, and reminding the women that winter in this place would be harsh. It also brought the first opportunity to send letters home through the International Red Cross. Captain Morrison announced that each prisoner could write 1 letter, limited to 100 words, subject to censorship, with no guarantee of delivery or response. The women received the news with a mixture of hope and dread. For many, it would be the first communication with their families since capture, perhaps the first confirmation that they were even alive. Keiko sat in the barracks for 3 evenings trying to compose her letter. 100 words seemed both too many and too few. How could she possibly convey everything she had experienced, everything she had learned, everything she now questioned about the world and her place in it? She wrote draft after draft, crossing out lines, starting over, struggling to find words that would pass the censor while still communicating something true about her situation. She couldn't mention the camp's location or the treatment she received. She couldn't describe the Americans she had met or the strange kindness she had encountered. The rules left her with only the most basic information. Finally, she wrote simply to her parents in Osaka, telling them she was alive and unharmed, that she was being held as a prisoner of war in America, that she hoped they and her younger brother were safe and well. She asked about their health, about whether their neighborhood had survived the bombing raids, about whether the small medical clinic where her father worked was still standing. She told them she thought of them every day and prayed for their safety. She signed it with love and folded it carefully, knowing these few inadequate sentences might be the only connection to her family for months or even years. Watching the other women write their letters was heartbreaking. Some wrote quickly, as if afraid they might lose courage if they thought too long. Others stared at blank paper for hours, unable to begin. Yuki wept openly as she wrote to her parents in Hiroshima, not knowing if they were alive to receive her words, but needing to send them anyway. Several women chose not to write at all, believing their families would be shamed by having a daughter or sister who had been captured, who had failed to die honorably in service to the emperor. The act of writing those letters forced all of them to confront questions they had been avoiding. What would their families think of them now? Would they be welcomed home or rejected as failures? How had Japan changed since they left? Were their loved ones even alive? The uncertainty was agonizing, but it also clarified something for Keiko. She realized that regardless of what awaited her in Japan, she was no longer the same person who had left Osaka 2 years earlier. The woman who had served without question, who had believed everything she was told about enemies and duty and honor, that woman was gone. In her place was someone new, someone still forming, someone who had learned that the world was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The work on the Patterson Ranch became a regular assignment for Keiko and several other women. 3 days each week, they made the journey from camp to help with the endless tasks that ranch life demanded. The physical labor was hard, harder than anything Keiko had done as a nurse, but she found it strangely satisfying. There was honesty in physical work, a simplicity that offered relief from the complicated questions that filled her mind during quiet moments. Her hands developed calluses, her muscles grew stronger, and she slept more soundly than she had since before the war. Mrs. Patterson gradually warmed to the Japanese women working her land. She saw how carefully they handled tools, how they never complained about difficult tasks, how they worked until a job was truly finished rather than merely adequate. One chilly morning, she brought out thermoses of hot coffee for the workers, a gesture that surprised everyone. The women accepted gratefully, wrapping their cold hands around the warm cups. Mrs. Patterson watched them drink and said to Jake, "They're good workers, better than most of the lazy boys I've hired over the years." It was high praise from a woman not given to sentimentality. Jake had been teaching Keiko more English during their breaks, and her progress amazed him. She had a natural aptitude for languages and an intensity of focus that made her an exceptional student. Their conversations evolved beyond simple vocabulary drills into halting but genuine exchanges of ideas. She told him about nursing, about tending to wounded soldiers, about the satisfaction of helping people heal. He told her about ranching, about the satisfaction of working with animals and land, about the way of life that had shaped him. They discovered unexpected common ground in their shared appreciation for work that served others. One afternoon, Jake brought Keiko to see a mare that was about to give birth. The animal was restless and uncomfortable, pacing in her stall. Jake explained in simple English, mixed with gestures, that the foal would come soon. That birth was always difficult but beautiful. Keiko understood more than he realized. She had assisted at births before, human births in field hospitals where conditions were far from ideal. When the mare went into active labor, Keiko moved instinctively to help, her nursing training taking over. She spoke softly in Japanese to the laboring animal, her voice calm and reassuring, her hands gentle but confident as she checked the mare's progress. Jake watched in amazement as this enemy prisoner, this woman who should have been a stranger in every way, helped bring a new life into the world with the same skill and compassion she must have shown to wounded soldiers. When the foal finally emerged, wet and trembling and perfect, Keiko's face showed pure joy. She looked up at Jake with tears in her eyes and said in careful English, "Life is beautiful, always beautiful." In that moment, standing in a barn in Montana, watching a newborn foal struggle to its feet, Jake understood that the war had already ended between them, regardless of what governments and generals might say. November 6, 1945. The date would remain burned in Keiko's memory forever. Captain Morrison had gathered all the prisoners in the camp's main hall for a mandatory assembly. His face was grave, and the guards who lined the walls looked uncomfortable, uncertain. A radio sat on a table at the front of the room, its presence unusual and ominous. The women filed in silently, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Keiko felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. News from home was never good anymore. Captain Morrison spoke in English, and Keiko translated quietly for the women around her. "Ladies, I have news from Japan that you need to hear. I want you to listen to this broadcast, and then we'll answer any questions you have." He turned on the radio, and an American announcer's voice filled the room. The broadcast described the aftermath of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. The women had heard rumors about a powerful new weapon, but nothing had prepared them for the detailed descriptions now emerging. Entire cities vaporized in an instant. Tens of thousands killed immediately, with thousands more dying slowly from mysterious radiation sickness. Survivors wandering through ruins, their skin burned and peeling, searching for family members who had been reduced to shadows on walls. Yuki's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She had been writing letters to her parents in Hiroshima for months, letters that had never been answered. Now, she understood why. Keiko reached for her hand, gripping it tightly as the broadcast continued with more details about the devastation. Other women began crying openly, their careful composure finally breaking under the weight of this news. Some had family in those cities. Others were horrified simply by the scale of destruction, by the realization that modern warfare had evolved into something capable of erasing entire populations in seconds. The broadcast also described Japan's current condition. Cities throughout the country lay in ruins from conventional bombing raids. The economy had collapsed. Millions were homeless and starving. The occupation forces under General MacArthur were working to rebuild, but the task was overwhelming. The Emperor himself had announced Japan's surrender, his voice heard on radio for the first time, a divine figure reduced to acknowledging defeat. Everything the women had been raised to believe about Japan's invincibility, about the divine protection of their homeland, had proven to be a lie. When the broadcast ended, Captain Morrison turned off the radio and faced the devastated women. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and Keiko could hear genuine sympathy in his voice. "I know this is difficult news. If any of you need to talk or need help contacting the Red Cross for information about your families, we'll do what we can." The women sat in stunned silence, unable to process the magnitude of what they had heard. Keiko felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Japan, the country she had served without question, the homeland she had expected to return to, no longer existed in any form she would recognize. What were they now? Where did they belong? The days following the radio broadcast were the darkest since the women's arrival at the camp. They moved through their routines like ghosts, their faces hollow with grief and shock. Many stopped eating properly. Some refused to leave their barracks, except when absolutely required. The careful stability they had built over the past months crumbled under the weight of knowing what had happened to their homeland. Keiko tried to maintain her composure for the sake of the younger women, but at night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if her family had survived, if her father's clinic still stood, if there was anything left to return to. What surprised her most was the reaction of the American guards. She had expected celebration, perhaps even cruel remarks about Japan getting what it deserved. Instead, she witnessed something that contradicted everything she thought she understood about enemies and warfare. The guards became gentler, more patient. They spoke in softer tones and made fewer demands. Several brought small gifts, extra food from their own rations, magazines with pictures to distract from darker thoughts, wildflowers picked from the prairie and left awkwardly on barracks doorsteps. Jake found Keiko sitting alone outside the mess hall 3 days after the broadcast, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally, he said in his careful, simple English, "I'm sorry about your country, about your family. War is terrible for everyone." Keiko turned to look at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or insincerity. She found only genuine sympathy. "Your brother," she said slowly, remembering that Mrs. Patterson had mentioned a son in the Pacific. "He fights in Japan?" Jake nodded. "He's in the occupation forces now, in Tokyo." The irony hung between them. His brother was in her country while she was in his. Both of them displaced by a war neither had chosen. "I hate what happened," Jake continued, struggling to express complicated thoughts in words Keiko would understand. "The bombs, all the death. I know Japanese people aren't all soldiers. They're farmers, teachers, families, like us." His words broke something open inside Keiko. Tears she had been holding back for days finally came, silent streams running down her face. Jake pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her, the same gesture of courtesy he would show any woman in distress. Mrs. Patterson proved equally unexpected in her compassion. When Yuki learned definitively through the Red Cross that her entire family had perished in Hiroshima, the older woman held the sobbing girl in her arms, rocking her and murmuring comfort despite the language barrier. "I know what it is to lose people," Mrs. Patterson said to Captain Morrison later. "These girls didn't drop those bombs. They didn't start this war. They're just caught in it like the rest of us." Her words spread through the small ranching community, influencing how other locals viewed the Japanese prisoners. Gradually, the women were seen less as dangerous enemies and more as fellow human beings suffering the consequences of decisions made far above their heads. Late November brought an unexpected invitation that would further transform the relationship between the prisoners and their captors. The town of Red Lodge held an annual harvest dance, a tradition that had continued even during the war years as a way for the community to come together before winter's isolation set in. This year, several ranch families who had been employing the Japanese women suggested that the prisoners be allowed to attend. The proposal sparked heated debate in town meetings and at the camp. Some residents objected strongly, arguing it was inappropriate to socialize with enemy nationals. Others, particularly those who had met the women personally, argued that showing basic human decency was what separated Americans from their enemies. Captain Morrison ultimately decided to allow those prisoners who wished to attend to do so under guard supervision. Keiko was surprised by how many of the women wanted to go despite their grief. Perhaps they needed distraction from their sorrows, or perhaps they were simply curious about this aspect of American culture they had heard the guards discussing with such enthusiasm. On the evening of the dance, 15 women climbed into trucks for the journey into town, wearing the best versions of their simple prison clothing, their hair carefully arranged in styles that mixed Japanese and American influences. The community hall was decorated with cornstalks, pumpkins, and colorful autumn leaves. A small band played music that was completely foreign to the Japanese women, lively fiddle tunes and guitar songs with rhythms that made people want to move. The townspeople who had come for an evening of dancing found themselves confronted with the reality of the Japanese prisoners they had heard about, but mostly never seen. An awkward silence fell as the women entered, everyone uncertain about how this unprecedented situation should unfold. It was Jake who broke the tension. He walked directly to Keiko and, with exaggerated formality, asked in his careful English, "Miss Keiko, may I have this dance?" She stared at him in confusion, having no idea what American dancing involved. He showed her how to position her hands, one on his shoulder and one in his hand, and began leading her in a simple two-step. She followed awkwardly at first, concentrating intensely on not stepping on his feet, but gradually found the rhythm. Other cowboys approached other Japanese women, and soon the dance floor filled with unlikely pairs moving to unfamiliar music. Mrs. Patterson danced with Yuki, showing the young woman the steps with patient encouragement. Other ranch wives followed her example, their initial hesitation overcome by simple human friendliness. The band played slower songs to accommodate the learning dancers, and the hall filled with laughter as women apologized for missteps and cowboys demonstrated exaggerated patience. Someone brought out apple cider and cookies, and during the break between dances, conversations happened in mixed English and Japanese, facilitated by gestures and genuine effort to communicate. Keiko found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, as Jake attempted to teach her a square dance, the complicated calls completely incomprehensible, but the energy infectious. For a few hours, in a community hall in Montana, the war seemed very far away. They were simply people sharing music, movement, and the warmth of human connection. December arrived with heavy snow that transformed the Montana landscape into an endless white expanse. Inside the warm barracks, the women faced a decision that would define the rest of their lives. Official repatriation orders had arrived from Washington. Ships were being organized to return Japanese prisoners of war to their homeland, with departures scheduled to begin in late January. Each woman would be processed through occupation headquarters in Tokyo before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. Captain Morrison delivered the news with his characteristic directness, but Keiko could see conflicted emotions in his face. The announcement should have brought relief, even joy. Freedom, home, return to everything they had been taken from. Instead, it sparked agonizing internal debates among the women. Late into the nights, they talked in hushed Japanese conversations about what awaited them in Japan. The country described in recent reports bore no resemblance to the homeland they remembered. Cities destroyed, economy collapsed, millions starving, occupation forces controlling everything. More troubling were the reports about how returned prisoners of war were being treated. They were viewed as failures, as soldiers who had dishonored themselves by allowing capture rather than choosing death. Keiko wrestled with the decision alone in the darkness. She had spent months writing letters to her family with no response. Either they were dead, or they were unable or unwilling to write back. She had no way of knowing which. The thought of returning to Osaka to find her home destroyed, her family gone, was almost unbearable. But the alternative was equally terrifying. To stay in America would mean abandoning any hope of reconnecting with her past, embracing a future in a foreign land where she would always be marked as enemy, as other, as someone who didn't fully belong. Yuki's situation was even more painful. She knew her family was dead, knew there was nothing waiting for her in Hiroshima, but radiation-poisoned ruins. Yet she felt a powerful pull toward Japan, a sense that her duty lay in helping rebuild what had been destroyed. "If everyone who survives leaves," she said to Keiko one night, "who will make Japan whole again?" Her words haunted Keiko, raising questions about obligation and loyalty that had no easy answers. What did they owe to a country that had lied to them, that had used them, that might reject them upon return? The women who had been working at the Patterson Ranch faced an additional complication. Mrs. Patterson had approached Captain Morrison with an extraordinary offer. She would sponsor several of the women to remain in America as ranch workers, providing employment and housing, helping them navigate the immigration process. Similar offers came from other ranch families who had employed the prisoners and been impressed by their dedication and skill. These offers represented not just employment but acceptance, a chance to build new lives in communities that had come to see them as individuals rather than enemies. The choice seemed impossible. Return to a destroyed homeland that might reject them, or stay in enemy territory that had shown them unexpected kindness. Neither option offered certainty or comfort, only different forms of risk and hope. Christmas approached with the same festive energy that had characterized the harvest dance, but the celebrations felt bittersweet to the Japanese women who knew they would soon be making irreversible decisions about their futures. The guards decorated the camp with pine branches and handmade ornaments, and local families donated gifts of warm clothing and practical items for the women's journey, whether that journey led back to Japan or forward into new American lives. The generosity was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the treatment they had expected as enemy prisoners. On Christmas Eve, Captain Morrison held a meeting where each woman could formally declare her intention to accept repatriation or to apply for permission to remain in the United States. The process was voluntary, he emphasized. No one would be forced either to stay or to leave, but the decision needed to be made soon so that appropriate arrangements could be finalized. The women sat in tense silence as he explained the procedures, each of them carrying the weight of the choice they had been contemplating for weeks. Keiko had made her decision 3 days earlier while working at the Patterson Ranch. She had been mending a fence with Jake when he asked her directly what she planned to do. "I don't know," she had answered honestly. "Part of me needs to go home, to see if my family survived, to honor my duty to Japan. But another part of me fears what I will find there, fears that the Japan I return to will not want me." Jake had been quiet for a long time before responding. "My mother wants you to stay. She says you're the best worker she's ever had. But more than that, she says you've become like family. Whatever you decide, we'll respect it. But know that you have a place here if you want it." Those words had broken through Keiko's indecision. She realized that she had been thinking about the choice as if it were between loyalty and betrayal, between honor and shame. But perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was about choosing where she could build a meaningful life, where she could contribute and grow and become the person she wanted to be rather than the person her country's propaganda had tried to make her. She thought about the skills she had developed, the English she had learned, the friendships she had formed. She thought about how she had helped deliver that foal, how Mrs. Patterson had started teaching her to bake bread, how the local doctor had suggested she might be able to continue nursing if she pursued American certification. When Captain Morrison asked for declarations, Keiko stood and said in clear English, "I wish to stay in America." Her voice was steady despite the tears on her face. Around the room, other women stood as well. Yuki rose, her decision visible in her determined expression. "I will return to Japan. My country needs people who understand both cultures, who can help bridge the gap between Japan and America. I must go home." 11 women chose to stay. 31 chose repatriation. Each decision was respected. Each woman's reasoning understood by those who had shared this extraordinary experience. January 23, 1946. The morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned the ground iron-hard beneath their feet. The women who had chosen repatriation stood in formation one last time, but this formation was different from all the others. They wore civilian clothes donated by local families, warm coats and sturdy boots for the journey ahead. Their few possessions were packed in simple bags, along with letters from American friends to carry back to Japan, testaments to the unlikely connections formed in this remote Montana camp. The women who had chosen to stay lined up, facing them, and for a long moment the two groups simply looked at each other, separated by only a few feet of frozen ground, but about to be divided by oceans and entirely different futures. Yuki stepped forward first, moving to embrace Keiko despite the formal setting. "Write to me," she whispered in Japanese. "Tell me about your life here. Help me remember that enemies can become friends, that hatred doesn't have to be permanent." Keiko held her tightly, this young woman who had become like a sister over the past months. "Go home and rebuild Japan into something better than it was. Show them what you learned here about forgiveness and second chances." Other women embraced, tears flowing freely now, all pretense of military discipline abandoned. These were not soldiers saying goodbye. These were friends, sisters in experience, if not in blood, parting with genuine grief, despite knowing their choices were right for each of them. The guards watched with their own emotions visible on weathered faces. Even Captain Morrison seemed affected, his usual military bearings softened by the scene unfolding before him. Jake approached Keiko as the farewells continued. He carried a small wooden box, roughly made but carefully sanded smooth. "Made this for you," he said, looking uncharacteristically shy. "For your things, for starting your new life." Inside, Keiko found a few items he had collected: a smooth stone from the ranch, a dried wildflower from the prairie, a photograph of the Patterson family with Keiko standing among them. At the bottom was a small carved horse, imperfect but clearly made with care. "So you remember," he said simply. Keiko couldn't speak past the emotion in her throat, so she simply bowed deeply in the Japanese manner, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Mrs. Patterson had come to see the women off, bringing boxes of food for their journey and warm embraces for each one. To Yuki she gave a small Bible with pressed flowers marking various pages. "For hope," she said through Keiko's translation. "Remember that you're stronger than you know." The buses that would take the repatriating women to the train station idled nearby, their engines rumbling in the cold air. As the women boarded, they looked back at the camp that had been their home for 6 months, at the people who had transformed from enemies into friends, at the vast Montana landscape that had taught them so much about themselves. Both groups waved until the buses disappeared from sight, each carrying hope and fear and determination into unknown futures shaped by choices made in the unlikeliest of places. 25 years later, in 1971, Keiko Patterson stood in a comfortable living room in Red Lodge, Montana, looking at photographs spread across the coffee table. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was pulled back in a practical bun. Her hands, weathered from decades of ranch work, held a letter that had arrived that morning from Japan. It was from Yuki, now Dr. Yuki Matsumoto, a prominent educator in Hiroshima who had dedicated her life to teaching reconciliation and peace studies. The letter invited Keiko to speak at an international conference about the transformative power of human connection across cultural divides. Keiko had married Jake in 1948 after completing her nursing certification and becoming a respected member of the Red Lodge community. Their marriage had raised eyebrows initially, but their evident devotion to each other and their contributions to the community had won over even the most skeptical neighbors. They had raised 3 children who grew up bilingual, learning Japanese from their mother and English from their father, embodying the bridge between 2 cultures that their parents' unlikely union represented. Mrs. Patterson, who had passed away 5 years earlier, had delighted in her grandchildren and never let anyone forget that hiring those Japanese prisoners had been the best decision she ever made. The 11 women who had chosen to stay in America had all built successful lives, though each path was unique. Some had married and raised families. Others had pursued careers in nursing, teaching, and business. They maintained close connections with each other, gathering annually to remember their shared experience and to celebrate how far they had come. They also maintained correspondence with the women who had returned to Japan, creating a network of friendship that spanned the Pacific and proved that bonds formed in adversity could endure across decades and distances. Those who had returned to Japan had played their own crucial role in rebuilding their country. Several had become leaders in Japanese-American friendship organizations, using their experience to help heal the wounds between the 2 nations. Yuki had become particularly influential, writing books about her experience and advocating for educational programs that emphasized understanding over hatred, reconciliation over revenge. Her work had inspired a generation of Japanese students to see former enemies as potential friends, to understand that individual human connections could transcend national conflicts. Keiko picked up another photograph, one taken on that first day when Jake had brought them Coca-Cola. The image was grainy and faded, but she could still see the surprise and cautious hope on the women's faces as they accepted those cold bottles. That simple gesture had been the beginning of everything, the first crack in the wall of mutual suspicion and hatred. From that small act of kindness had grown friendships, love, new lives, and eventually a legacy that continued to influence how people thought about enemies, forgiveness, and the possibility of transformation. She wrote back to Yuki that evening, accepting the invitation to speak. She would tell their story once more, would remind another generation that even in the darkest times of human conflict, individual people could choose compassion over hatred, could choose to see the humanity in those they had been taught to despise. The story of Japanese women prisoners who found unexpected kindness in the hands of Montana cowboys, who tasted Coca-Cola and discovered that enemies could become family, remained as relevant as ever. It was a reminder that the greatest victories were not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when people chose connection over division, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair.